Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kayla Myers, and I'm from the South by Southwest EDU programming team. It's been a phenomenal first day of programming, and it feels fitting to end our featured program for the day with a conversation addressing the future of education research and innovation. Understanding how students learn, under what conditions, and through what support systems has become all more critical as traditional education systems have been upended over the last few years. Today, we'll hear from leaders dedicated to improving the quality, scale, and pace of education research. As a reminder, during the Q&A, please remember to ask questions through the Engage button on your South by Southwest EDU Go app. I'm thrilled to introduce Angela Duckworth, Kumar Garg, Mark Schneider, and Mary Murphy to the stage. But first, please welcome David Yeager, Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, to give background and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Yeager. I'm a researcher and a former teacher, and I organized this panel because I believe in its potential to shape the future of education and our future generations. So let's take a step back. What is the scientific method? Hypothesize, test, measure, repeat. It's given us breakthroughs that have shaped human history. In education, what has it given us? A lot, but not nearly enough. Immunologists sequenced the COVID-19 virus in weeks, completed vaccine trials in months, and scaled them in under a year. Education R&D hasn't yet done anything of the sort. In fact, the problems facing young people and teachers today are so great, they're so advanced, that we need innovation more than ever. Students learned very little over the last 2 years. They're also facing an epidemic of stress and mental health problems. Disengagement is rampant, and teachers are showing the same problems. Right now, it all feels like it's just too much. And so what can we do about it? If we think about education R&D compared to biomedical research, I'd argue that the problem does not lie in a lack of ideas or a lack of talent, but rather in a fundamentally broken way that we do education research. In particular, education researchers and educators have a lot of great ideas that could have the potential to transform our future. But we don't have anywhere near the kind of education R&D system that we need to test them and spread them. To give you an example, we conducted a national experiment testing a growth mindset intervention in 76 schools across the country, 16,000 students. It was a landmark, a breakthrough study. But how do you do that? You fly to 76 schools, you pull data records from 76 different administrative data systems, and you end up testing one idea in 5 years, right? If we did biomedical research the way that we do education R&D, it would mean that in response to every new disease or every new strain, all infrastructure would be developed from scratch. So you would build entirely new labs for every new COVID variant, you would hire new staff, you would buy new equipment, and you would calibrate new equipment. And you would do that in every lab across the country every time there was a new scientific question. Obviously, if we did that, we would never prevent widespread harm that comes from those diseases before they got out of hand. And yet, that's how we do education R&D. Every individual investigator has to recruit individual partners. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's not cutting it. To give another example, consider that conduct one experiment testing just one teaching practice, you'd need about 100 teachers. That's up to 10,000 students, maybe in 50 districts, and that's just to test one idea. In a world where there are thousands of potentially transformative teacher practices and infinite combinations of them, can we truly afford to evaluate them one at a time? That's the status quo. So what if education R&D was different? Could world-class education researchers conduct research at a pace that's necessary for the magnitude of the problems and the rate at which they're growing? This is not an easy challenge to overcome. It will take coordination, partnership, and will. But our students and our families and our teachers need us to make this progress. And that's why we have this panel today. So let's meet our distinguished group of panelists. Angela Duckworth, recently named the most influential thought leader in education, is a MacArthur Award winner. She's a world-class scientist. You may know her for popularizing work about grit and self-control, but you might not know that she's been building next-generation R&D infrastructure with her colleague Sean Talamus, called the Character Lab Research Network. Character Lab conducts hundreds of large experiments each year, when the status quo previously was handfuls. Mary Murphy is a renowned psychologist who, in her groundbreaking work, identified how growth or fixed mindset cultures in organizations can create a culture of inclusion in universities and workplaces. She's the co-PI of the massive experiment called the College Transition Collaborative, working with 26 colleges over multiple years, the kinds of massive experiments that set the standard for experimentation and yet are difficult to repeat and costly to conduct. Murphy has also launched an innovative new R&D infrastructure called the Equity Accelerator that she'll talk about today. We're joined by Mark Schneider, the director of the IES, the largest education funder in the country. Mark, together with the fourth panelist, Kumar Garg from Schmidt Futures, has led a new visioning process to rethink how traditional education funders support R&D. They're imagining new ways to break out of the old cycle of one experiment every 5 years and into a new era of rapid and fruitful experimentation. Kumar and his team at Schmidt have made dozens of bets on products, some of which might be yours here in the audience, that hold promise to be open, accessible platforms for next-gen education R&D. So why is this a panel? It's a panel because to really solve the problem, we need everyone's contribution, including yours. So I want you to start by adding your questions through the Engage button on the South by Southwest EDU app, and continue to have the conversation even after this panel today. And I want you to ask yourselves, can we form the right partnerships across sectors to achieve the education innovation that our students and teachers so badly need? I think we can, because I think we must. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kumar, who will direct this panel and take your questions. Kumar and panel, welcome up.
Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? It is incredible to be in person at a conference. It's my first time being at one in 2 years, so I'm visibly nervous, but it's incredible to have all of you here. It's incredible to have everybody who's here watching online. And, you know, part of the reason I think I was really excited about it, you know, David had told me that he had talked to the organizers at South by about this topic, and I kind of didn't believe him. It is so nerdy. It is so nerdy to talk about education R&D as a panel topic. This is like the kind of thing that gets skipped over, you know? It's like, let's talk about what's gonna be the amazing thing and how's COVID changing everything, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just excited that we're gonna talk about the underlying engines for how do we get new stuff. And part of it, as David was saying, is this is an incredible panel of people who are actively struggling through how this works. And I think the COVID and vaccines analogy is an important one. But I don't know, do you guys remember right as COVID hit, the New York Times and all these other places had this like visual for like, how long does it take for vaccines to happen? And they were like, if you just sort of estimate it out, it's like maybe we'll get a vaccine in 34 years. If we're really lucky, we'll get it in 15 years, right? And we sort of just jumped ahead and got these incredible vaccines in, you know, what felt like basically a year, less than a year. But, you know, we then got into all the political fights about it. But actually, that was a marvel of human execution, but actually also of this thing that we call R&D infrastructure. How do we take ideas, how do we test them, and how do we test them at a level of fidelity where you're actually willing to put it in someone's arm? Because with education, we're talking about our kids, right? So you're not talking about experiments that are low consequence. These are really important. So part of what I'm hoping in our conversation today is just to give you like a taste for their trade-offs. This is hard work, but this is not like a thing you get to just skip over, because, you know, the reason I sort of got passionate about this was I was working in the Obama White House, and one of the things you can do is you can like look up old talking points. I'm like the young guy, and I looked up the talking points for the Clinton guys who had been in OSTP and sort of doing the ed tech thing. These sounded really similar. Like the only difference was it said CD-ROM, like the power of Alexandria in a CD-ROM, and I was like, oh, this is bad. Like these are good talking points. I could use these talking points. So that just got me sort of interested in like, well, why do we? And it led to this whole thread of why we spend most of our R&D dollars on a handful of things. We spend it on defense, which obviously matters. We spend it on health, but we spend less on education R&D than the potato chip industry spends on potato chips.
Yeah.
Right? So that's like a problem. So what is that dynamic and how do we change it is part of what we're going to talk about. So let me start with Angela. So I think part of what we want to do is, folks should continue to start to add questions on the Engage app, and we'll start to incorporate. But Angela, David put it well. You're incredibly well known. I love the book. I love the frame. I was on the plane here. I was reading a book which said, my idea is not really a grid idea. It's a stamina idea. So it's like the idea is so powerful that people are like, so. But I think the part that I find really exciting is the work that UPenn has done has actually been a lot of innovation, whether it's mega studies, whether it's the work with Sean. So I'd just be curious, like when you were coming up, what are the challenges researchers face in actually being able to design and launch an experiment? And why does making this work easier actually matter and actually actually creating good things in the world?
Thank you for having me. And since you shared a little of your story and why you got so excited about what I think is not just a slightly nerdy panel, but kind of the sexiest panel at South by. And I do want to share a story. So I went to graduate school when I was 32 years old, and I wanted to do research in schools with kids. I had previously been a high school math teacher, and so for me, I went and found a school, and I baked banana bread for everybody in the front office, and I figured out how to get the parents to sign the consent forms, and of course I knew about student information systems because I had been in public school systems in New York and San Francisco. So I navigated a lot of stuff, and while I was doing it, I was thinking, this is kind of like putting on a Broadway show, but it's doable. And I did collect my data, and then later on, when I became a professor, and I met other people, particularly educators who wanted to see this panel happen, and people who thought, you know what schools need, you know what teachers need? They need a science-based understanding of how kids feel when they belong, when they don't belong, why they give up, why they sometimes don't give up. So when I thought to myself, yeah, we should have more scientists doing more research in schools to make it, like David was saying, more like an innovation sector as opposed to a this is how we've always done it sector, it did not occur to me that scientists would lack some of the capacities that I had as a former teacher. There was no banana bread. There were many problems with student information systems. There were very few consent forms being signed, and this is how I knew. I had created this nonprofit called Character Lab, and we were giving grants away to scientists who said, I'll do some research in schools. And we gave them each hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we gave them 2 to 3 years to collect, actually, honestly, only a few hundred data points each from schools studying what they were studying. And at the end of this cycle, what we found is that aside from one person who already was, like me, a former teacher, and another scientist who was married to a teacher, all of the scientists had failed to collect their data. And I don't think it was for lack of trying. So I won't take too much longer, but I'll just say that the skill set that you need, the tacit knowledge that you need to navigate K-12 education in this country is not a skill set that you go to graduate school as a social scientist to get. And I don't think it's necessarily something that social scientists as a rule excel in. And I think the reason why this panel is so important, if not sexy, certainly urgent, is because like this is the revolution that we need. And I can see some of the problems. Lack of shared research infrastructure is an enormous one. And I think if I could go back in time, instead of giving those scientists a few $100,000 to spend on research coordinators and so forth, I would have given them research infrastructure. And that's what Character Lab Research Network is, but also that's what some of the other things that the panelists are going to be talking about is also.
It's amazing. So I already see questions coming in, which is amazing. So I'm going to use one of them as I call on Mary next. So Mary, one of the things that Corinne mentioned, which is, she said, people aren't like viruses.
Yes.
Fair enough.
Yes.
And so when we're building social science research, this has been your life's work, how do we sort of think about how are we the same? How are we different? How do we think about replication? I mean, these are like deep questions, but you know, how does that sort of intersect? So it'd be both useful, just what got you religion on this,
Yeah.
But also this question of how do you sort of marry that when we're talking about, you know, something that makes maybe education and biology different or maybe the same?
Great. Yeah, I'm trained as a social behavioral psychologist, so I'm a social psychologist by training. And as I was doing more and more work in education environments, I was seeing really this, how susceptible education is to these kinds of fad approaches, where you'd have a famous researcher publishing this incredible study in a high impact journal. And, you know, because the need is so great on the ground, people would say, wow, that's incredible. I want to do it here and there. And then it would scale very quickly. People would try practices or try, you know, what was published in these studies. And then it would work some places and it wouldn't work in others. And what do we take the meaning of that to be? A lot of people say, well, that intervention, it just doesn't work. And then we move on to the next fad. And so that fad, you know, nature of education science, the answer is not that we have a ton of interventions that don't necessarily replicate. The answer is that we don't have a serious idea of heterogeneity in education science. It's not just, will this replicate here in this smaller school district or in this larger school district, but actually what is the underlying process of the intervention that makes it more likely to work here or less likely to work there? For whom, under what circumstances? And that's how people are not like viruses. They don't just replicate themselves everywhere. And so we need this theory of heterogeneity. And the thing that makes me most passionate about heterogeneity, which nerdy, right?
Nerdy and sexy.
Is that heterogeneity is an equity problem for at least 3 reasons. First, when we think about theory, who's developing our theories in education science? Oftentimes, it's the same group of researchers, oftentimes sampling from the same school districts that are readily accessible to them because it takes so much to get the work off the ground. And that means also the same student bodies that are participating in these studies over and over and over again. And so that's a problem of theory. It's a problem of people. And then finally, when you actually do an equity and heterogeneity analysis of what works and what doesn't in education science, you discover it's a problem of context. You discover that there are some places, learning environments that are really great for students and others that are not. But what do we actually fund? Generally, we fund these interventions and problems and practices that are direct to student, meant to change something about their motivation or their study skills or other kinds of oftentimes deficit focus on the students themselves. But with the theory of heterogeneity, we can understand the culture that surrounds students and actually start to do interventions with culture creators, the teachers, the faculty, the administrators, and the staff to really focus on the environment to make them more of the context where the studies will replicate and where we'll see stronger results in terms of heterogeneity and outcomes. So I think this is really an issue of equity. People, theories that are surfaced, and then also thinking about the unit of analysis, not just students themselves, but also the culture creators and the context and learning environment. And only with the shared infrastructure are we going to get there.
That's great. So, Mark, I'm going to do some of the same, which is what got you religion on this topic, but also, and this will take work for you. What are bright spots? That things that get you excited, and when you're sitting there, with a very capable team that is, if there's anybody who's thinking every day about how to drive the future of education R&D, it is, IES as one of the premier organizations in the world that invest in education R&D. Obviously you have a fierce urgency of now, but I'd just be curious both what gave you that urgency, but also how you've been trying to channel it.
Oh, so I actually wasn't prepared to talk about my history. So
Although I asked you backstage, so great, I get the story now.
No, I know you set me up for that, but that was going to be over breakfast, not in front of this audience. I would just answer it the following way. So there's an urgency that I've had in my entire life, and I've never been happy, maybe ever on anything, but I'm certainly not happy with the condition of education research. And I've been forcing my agency, IAS, and I was previously the commissioner of NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, to improve, to change, to be faster, better, and cheaper. So I'm going to answer two things. I'm going to say two things that I think are really driving me at the current time. So when I took over IAS 4 years ago, I backed into this crazy thing called the SEER Principles. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at this, and if you've ever tried to get money from us, you know that they exist, and we're taking them quite seriously. So there are 8 principles, and what they are designed to talk about the rigorous research and how to make education research better. You could look them up, but some of the things that I think are the most important are generalizability, scalability, because we never talk about scalability, right? I mean, in part because we fund academic researchers who aren't used to thinking about marketing. They're not used to thinking about scalability. So that to me is one of the SEER principles, which I asked you to look up. It's actually quite important in terms of structuring the way we think about, the way I think about research. But I want to give another example of what to me is like I think encompasses a lot of the things that we're talking about. So we're in the middle of an X Prize. And I was on an X Prize jury several years ago, and I just found the process so absolutely fascinating. It was fascinating because of the speed of it, the size of the challenge, the way in which the quote unquote peer review process was being conducted was so radically different. It was a prize for adult literacy, and it was just like a totally different mindset than the way we conducted business in academia, the way I was on many panels at NSF. It was just a totally different mindset. So I've always been worried about small N studies, which is almost everything that education research does. We know about all the problems in small N's, the biases that are in there. I mean, it's totally crazy. So we issued the X Prize challenge, and it's for platforms that had over 100,000 users. And some of this was driven by Jim Manzi, who really smart guy, and his thing, fail fast. So most things fail, right? That's just a fact. Most things fail. And not just in education sciences, but almost in every human endeavor, in part because humans aren't viruses, right? Okay.
Most viruses fail too, though.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but they kill lots of people on the way.
That's true.
Okay, so anyway, so I think, okay, fail fast. So we have small N problem, we need to break that. We need to speed up research, we need to fail fast, and we need to replicate. So I'm sure some of you heard my favorite Markism, like education science doesn't have a replication problem because we don't replicate. So, okay, so the X Prize is increasing student performance, and we're not even judging people on the intervention, we're judging them on the process of how fast they could set up experiments and how fast they could learn from those outcomes in those experiments to replicate in different geographies and different demographies. So this is, to me, is sort of what Mary's point is. Like, we cannot do the standard business model at IAS, 5 years, $5 million, failure. You know, David's point about, like, if we did our virus research or COVID research, we'd all be dead by now, right? And we would do 5 years, we'd give Johnson & Johnson 5 years, they come up with something, we give Novartis 5, after that doesn't work, another 5 years on somebody else, another years on 5 years, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't work. It's insane. It just doesn't work. So this is why establishing an infrastructure, a joint infrastructure, is important. This is why IAS is investing a lot of money in platforms to try to figure out how best to tap into large N's to test, fail fast, replicate, replicate, replicate.
So I think one thing that was useful for me, you know, so this Mark sort of calls it the small n problem, which I forgot which researcher I was talking to, and they said, if you read most research papers, and then once you sort of like are in on the trick, then you sort of look for it. It says, if you read most research papers, they'll go like this. I'm doing this on 12 kids. Here's what I'm doing. Then there's a section of the paper that says, this is why my findings are general to all kids. End of paper, right? And then there's like a move that like involves some math and some general thing. And then you're like, this is a keystroke study. Like keystrokes, that doesn't even take that long. Like you could do a keystroke study with thousands of students, but you have a keystroke study with 12 students. And then you have and then we spend all these other rooms talking about kids are different. There's lots of different contexts that they're in, but you're gonna eke out a generalizable principle out of this 12 kid study. So I guess one thing this took me a while to sort of unpack, like people are doing good faith work. They're doing it, they're working hard at it, but somehow we've optimized to that study, right? So Angela, it might be useful just like to start to unpack that, like, why did we end up, and if we're gonna build to a better system, you know, I don't think it can just fall on the individual teacher, the school, or the researcher, because some of these might require some upfront investment, you know, where once they've got their research budget, you know, they're kind of, at that point, I don't know what they, you know, it's like, I'm gonna put a grad student on it and we're gonna see how far we get. But I think unpacking it might be useful.
You know, the great thing about this problem, if there is a great thing, is that I think the scientists who want genuinely to do good work with and for kids, I think they get the problem. I think they're hamstrung by their constraints. I think that is why they need infrastructure to relieve those constraints. But I'll just say again, taking maybe a step back in time just to tell the story of how research used to be done. I mean, even before any of this existed, you know, you would recruit people one by one, you know, children one by one with their parents, you know, family by family, and you'd probably be pretty happy when you got to 12, right? Which is 6 in each group if you have 2 conditions. I mean, so you do read these old papers, and I'm sure we all have, and they really are ridiculous, to use a Marxism, right? Like, so I think though that almost every scientist that every scientist that I can think of, if they had a magic wand, they wouldn't have 12, they would have 1,200. They would have, depending on what they're studying, 12,000 or 120,000. So the great thing, if there is one, about this problem is that in the scheme of things, one group that you don't have to convince that this is all a great idea are the scientists. They desperately want to have more highly powered studies. You might want to convince them about replication, but you know, in general. And I think the key is that, and I think we are trying to make it a little sexier here, but the mundanity of school-based research cannot be over or exaggerated. I mean, it's incredibly tedious and boring. It's like, oh, and now we have to send the 47th email back to the third person because the second person just switched to another position. Actually, they might be in a different district, and I don't know where that email thread went, but now we have 4 days until this window because then there's gonna be a snow day, it's that kind of thing. And so I think the thing I would just leave you with was like, not only is it tedious, those fixed costs of like developing those relationships, alternatives, figuring out how to integrate with student information systems while protecting data privacy, et cetera. It's not that scientists don't have an appetite for the mundane, but they simply cannot on their own muster the costs and effort that would create these things. And so in some ways, another great thing is that the solution is also incredibly simple, which is create platform infrastructure. You know, in that sense, we're well ahead of other scientists who don't really know where to start. We have a very willing group of scientists who are going to use the platform infrastructure. And then I think we have some funders, and maybe you're in the room if you're listening to this and thinking that makes a lot of sense, who are willing to help fund the fixed costs that no single lab and no single scientist, no matter who they are, has the ability to create on their own.
So Mary, I think, you know, one thing that I find sort of exciting about, like, you know, what are the different benefits you get from investing in, you know, infrastructure that teachers and researchers and others can use? You know, one is obviously something Mark is talking about, which is replication, you know, being able to test an idea. And as we've seen in some of the sciences, like lots of things that intuitively feel like they should replicate don't.
Yeah.
So like kind of have to actually go looking. But I feel like another one that I find motivating for me is like this idea that we can democratize who does research. You know, and education has gone through a lot of interest in the researcher-teacher partnership and lots of different things. But you know, I have to say that like often I feel like it's more like the researcher designs the study, it's like the teachers are the user, like user testing. It's like, oh, hey, do you think this would be useful for you?
That's right.
Right? But the power relationship still sits on the researcher side. And one thing I've always been intrigued by is you can start to actually have educators actually be the experiment designers.
That's right.
And what might be the questions they would ask. But I'd be curious, you know, you built some of these systems where who can ask and design a question has been broadened. I'd just be curious how you see it sort of play out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best idea here to share is one of our latest projects that's been more of a faculty-focused or teacher-focused intervention created by our group, the College Transition Collaborative and the Equity Accelerator. And in this project, we had over 300 faculty. This was in the higher education space. And we had over 300 STEM faculty across 6 urban serving universities. So these are not universities that typically get sort of, you know, the attention and also the focus and research dollars focused on these questions, and particularly focused on faculty change. And so what we did in this project was we created tools that had some kind of evidence behind them, and we gave them to faculty, and faculty then became the experimenters. Faculty sort of took on using a continuous improvement design, we were able to sort of see how faculty would engage in these various practices and how they actually made them better. And we created a shared infrastructure such that the tools were shared, the data were shared, the assessment of students and how they were experiencing the classrooms when the faculty were participating in these programs, that was shared. And then the learning was shared as well. So we were able to do analysis of what we call, in nerdy terms, positive deviant analysis. Who were the teachers and faculty who were particularly good at changing their strategies with regards to their teaching, things they already did, first day of class lectures, the way that they gave feedback in class, how they answered questions when people raised their hand, how do you talk about tests in class? When they were really good at it and it actually changed students' sense of belonging and inclusion and motivation in class, how did we learn from their practices and then broadcast it to the larger community across these 6 universities and huge numbers of faculty so that they could then sort of take that and iterate upon it? And so it was actually very fast learning where the faculty themselves became the experimenters of their own context. They got their student data. They saw that they had equity gaps with regard to student motivation and belonging. And so they looked at the practices and they said, okay, this is what I could take on here. And they got data again to show that they were actually improving student outcomes, not just long-term, which they did. Students were more likely to get an A or B, less likely to get a D or F or W in those STEM classes in college, but also student experience in the moment. They were more motivated, felt like they belonged, and they took more classes afterwards as well. And these results accrued more broadly to, and particularly to, underrepresented students, Black students, Latino students, and Native students. So when we created this infrastructure, different faculty could really take it up and figure out their own experiments they wanted to create, and look at their data over time and iterate quickly in order to not have to just get one treatment for the whole term and then figure out whether or not it works at the end of the term or even at the end of the year, but instead sort of engage in this rapid learning process and then to share the learning with others. So I think that's what's possible when we invest in a shared R&D infrastructure, and when we have many researchers sort of thinking about what are the right interventions to feed to practitioners who then can make it better in the moment, right? I mean, that's what we really want to do. We don't want researchers to just come in and say, here, try this, do it this way. We actually want to learn in collaboration, and we want schools and teachers to be able to have something to be able to take with them and say, okay, here's what we've done, here's what we've learned, and here's how we're making student lives better.
It's great. So there's a great question. Everyone should continue to send questions. They're great. They continue to pop up, and then I can weave them into the conversation. So Krista has this question, which is, it's almost like a please define terms, which is like, hey, can you tell us more about what do you mean by platform infrastructure? And I can start with at least the way we've been sort of thinking about it. So one very basic idea that at Schmidt Futures I've been sort of working on is just, it's just this idea that we have this opportunity that digital learning platforms create, which is that they have large numbers of users, and just through a function of the way that they are instrumented and designed, they are more open to potentially being able to run large-scale trials at a fraction of the cost of other research studies. If that infrastructure could actually be used to run lots of high-quality experiments around why students might learn something or not, you can get interesting and surprising results. So one example, and part of it that was intriguing to me is things that the researchers themselves might think of as like, I don't think that's going to work. Sort of like widen the aperture. So Neil Heffernan, who's at Assessments, has this great example where there's a researcher that came to him. He opened up his platform for additional experimentation. They said, hey, my idea is, it's a math platform for homework help. And they said, I want to randomize on the spacing between the like how close together is the X plus Y, right? And like, if you can change the spacing, does that matter? My daughters are 8, and I was like, it made sense to me that like there'd be something there, but it was interesting. So Neil was skeptical as to whether spacing matters. They ran the study, and what children seem to do is when you space things together, they do that operation first. They skip the order of operations. So they will add the things that are closer together rather than multiply first, right? Now, maybe you get a bunch of nodding heads. Of course, that makes sense. But like, actually, that is not what we're like, oh, this is a bad experiment. It's not going to show any effect. So for me, when we say platform infrastructure, it is how do you make the ability to run an experiment and get a quick result and then try it within a new context, this idea that context matters again and again, a lot easier. And doing that is just hard if everything takes a long time and a lot of effort. But I'd be just sort of, so that's at least how I made sense of it to myself. So, but I'd be just curious how, like, we'll start with you, Mark, but like, you've funded some of this platform work, you've been thinking about this, like when you're looking for this, when you're pushing your team, what are some of the ways you try to think about what falls under infrastructure? And you've done some of these in existing programs, and I'd be just curious how other people want to respond to it.
Well, I mean, so your description is perfect, right? I'm not sure I could improve upon it, except I'm putting millions of dollars, I'm betting on these things. Neil is sitting up here. I think you've won 3, 4, 5 grants, right? And the reason is that, first of all, he's built a wonderful platform, limited purpose at the current time, but the fact of the matter is that he's opened it up, one of the first people to open up for experimenters. So he's part of a larger project that we just funded for 5 owners, headed by Digital Promise, of digital platforms, all with large user bases. They're working together now to figure out how to build a common infrastructure or common aspects across the 5 different platforms, and next year they will systematically open up their platforms for researchers.
Yeah.
So there's John Whitmer's here somewhere. So John said to me, the problem with traditional research is that researchers spend 80% of their time getting the data and 20% of the time doing the work. And as long as we do this bespoke models of individual researchers going out and
That's
researching
generous, by
problems.
the way. I think it's
Yeah,
fine.
okay. So,
Yeah.
So our goal is to go from 80-20 or 90-10 to flip it around. So I don't want people spending so much time, and I think you said like 4 years of trying to get people to do the work, and then the last year they spend, we give 5-year grants, the last year they have to spend writing the next proposal. So there's no time in there for the actual work. So our goal is to flip from 80-20 to 20-80. And anything that we could do to flip from 80-20 or 90-10 to flip that is something that is incredibly important. And we could keep getting more money from Congress, which I hope we do. But as long as we're spending so much of this money on the 80% of just data finding and setting up, we're just not going to make any progress. So this kind of rapid turnaround, fast failure, replicate is fundamental to what I think of when we fund these platforms.
Kumar, can I just tag on to that? So we talked about data infrastructure, legal, et cetera. There's another shared resource that Character Lab created, and I think it very much resonates with Mary's remarks. So there's fail fast, because it turns out it's very hard to predict what's going to work. Does the spacing work or not? But there's also failing because you have like zero empathy with the students you're trying to help. So what Character Lab created was a panel of teenagers, and you come to the panel if you're a scientist on our network and you say, I've got an idea. Let me run it by you. And I'll say, as a scientist who ran by several ideas that I was just convinced were the cat's pajamas. I was like, this is amazing. And they just fell they were like, no, that's a terrible idea. And then let me tell you why it's a terrible idea. You're solving a problem that doesn't exist for us. And I'll tell you what I did with those ideas, which is I just put them on a shelf and I didn't run them. So I completely embrace fail fast because it is so hard to know what's going to work or not. I also embrace don't fail for the most incredibly stupid reason of just not knowing your audience at all. And therefore, one of the shared resources that I think is important is student voice and having a panel of teenagers, because if you are a University of Chicago economist, you don't have like 12 teenagers that you can just call and pitch your idea and very quickly iterate in the way that I think we've all been talking about.
I'd also like to add here, I think that one of the benefits of a shared R&D infrastructure is that you can actually start to incorporate junior scholars, early career scholars, into the creation of these interventions and projects much earlier in the process. If you have a shared research infrastructure, like what David Yeager and I have been creating in the Algebra 1 space around the Texas Mindset Initiative, we created an infrastructure that allowed, multiple, at least 8 or 9 junior faculty and early career researchers to sort of figure out what kind of intervention would they want to do in the Algebra 1 space, and to then work with expert designers that we were able to source, taking advantage of some of the things that Angela was mentioning in terms of getting feedback from students very quickly, iterating on, what does this sound like? Also talking to teachers to see, would the teachers want to implement this kind of intervention in the context? And really being able to iterate on that quickly, it also got junior scholars interested in this pipeline of intervention science much earlier in their career, gave them access to a huge number of students that they never would have been able to surface themselves, allowed them to apply for IES grants and others because they now had pilot data. So it just builds a field in a more equitable way if we put an equity lens on it. And that's what shared research infrastructure could afford.
So could I I want to go back to an earlier point that Mary made, and that is, and you use the word democratization. So I've been struggling with this for some time now. So Mary said the school districts that get researched are a handful, and they happen to be located in Chicago, for example, or New York, or Los Angeles, right? And then the researchers who do the work are the same old, right? So what piqued my interest in this is the match, not Match.com, but the match, which is the way in which graduates from medical schools get matched with hospitals that need interns, right? So the match works for like 37,000 matches each year. Okay, and there's a clear interest on both sides of the equation, right? The hospitals need interns. The medical students that are graduating need internships, sorry. And there's the algorithm in 1982, Alvin Roth got a Nobel Prize for it, and another Nobel Prize later on in the early, 2005, I think. And so could we imagine a system that would democratize the research process by something like the match? So there are 14,000 school districts, and probably 20,000 people go to AERA. Okay, so if we, and I bet 2% of those school districts, 5% of those school districts have actually ever gotten systematic research, and of the 20,000 researchers in AERA, right? I mean, I know because I've asked for these numbers, right? The same 10 institutions, the same 20 researchers get all the money. Now, this is not an education research problem. This is a science problem across all the sciences, right? They're rainmakers. They win all the prizes. So Mary talks about her work. She's applied to IES grants 3 times and been turned down 3 times.
Never been funded by IES.
Okay.
Thank you, National Science Foundation.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, but I mean, but the point is,
anyone's listening.
but the point is that even good researchers, high quality researchers, run afoul of crazy rules and processes of peer review, which we need, but needs to be reformed.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to figure out a way. And by the way, the match, which we all know about, is actually run by a private foundation, a not-for-profit foundation. So I've talked to Josh Angrist and Avella in MIT, which solves problems like this, and they find it an interesting problem. Anytime someone tells you it's an interesting problem, you know you got a problem. So the problem is, like, why would school districts do this, right? And I'm thinking, like, if I could get 5% of the 14,000 school districts to say, yes, I'm sort of interested in this, if I can get a couple of thousand researchers, many from HBCUs, for example, MSIs, people that we know we've never funded, right? If we can get them into this match process, if we could certify them somehow, which is really part of the deal, we have to figure out how to certify a larger list of researchers. And somehow the school districts say, I need this work, these are my problems, right? And I have 5,000 researchers, and the algorithm is simple, right? We could probably do it on a spreadsheet because it's not, I mean, we're not 37,000 matches. But if we could imagine a system like that, it would democratize the research community.
It would.
And part of the problem, I worked for AIR for 10 years, right? And I mean, they're experts on getting IS money. And I mean, AIR, RTI, SRI, ATH, Mathematica, I mean, they control huge amounts of research money. And they do a fine job, but it's going to be the same problem, right? It's going to be the same, and literally the same problem,
So,
right?
I mean, one reason why Mark is both great to talk to and, like, especially fun to have on a panel is Mark doesn't have a filter, which means, like, you know, he will actually tell you what he is thinking. And so here you have the head of an agency thinking out loud about what keeps him up at night, ideas he's intrigued by, why he thinks the very institution he runs isn't doing a perfect job. I don't know how many people here, public officials, have that amount of just direct engagement with the community and honesty. So I think it's to be really applauded. I don't think this actually happens that much. But I think Mark's charge is a good one, which is it's not like Mark is going to figure this all out, right? It's like part of the reason he's struggling through this, he's worn different hats, Angela and Mary have others, and like there's a deep frustration I always get when I talk to people who are in this space. You know, school districts are like, all this research is getting funded, how am I supposed to use it? You know, I remember the biggest question members of Congress and their staffs would have, like, we fund this work, but like, how is it getting used? But then at the same time, researchers are visibly frustrated by the process by which it's created. Then you've got folks who are trying to build tools being like, what insights can I use to build the next tool?
Yeah.
Like, it's a system that is not humming, right? Everyone is kind of like, we get why it's important, where else are the good ideas going to come from? But it's kind of stuck. And what I sort of appreciate is like, we're not going to come up with one solution.
That's right.
But this kind of systematic approach is important. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. I think the place where I would love to sort of take the conversation and this can come through questions and everyone, I want people, my favorite thing is to be generative. What are things you can do? What are things you hope someone else can do? What are ideas you hope are bigger? What are ideas you wish someone would try? And this is how, like, when I was in the White House, we would just like generate what we'd call the big imagine if list. Imagine if you could call anybody and ask them to do something, who would you call and what would you ask for? And some of those decision makers are actually on the stage, so you know it's not bad. So, so I would love to start to collect, you know, and folks can post them in the questions, just like what would be your imagine if sentence or idea for what you think we can do. You know, there's things that Schmidt Futures have been doing around making a case for Mark to have more money from Congress. We've been making big advocates for a real increase in the IES budget. There's things that we're doing in funding various platforms, but all of this has actually come from conversations with the field for like, what do we actually need to do together if we're gonna build together? And as we, you know, it's like this conference is we're coming out of something, and I think we need to be setting big goals for ourselves. So I'd just be curious, what are the goals we should be setting for ourselves if we're gonna get through this that inspire you? So Mary, what do you think?
I mean, one of the things I'm thinking is that we're at this precipice. We're going to build a shared research infrastructure for education science. So how do we design it? My big what if is, what if we build equity into it at the front end? What we know is that when we build infrastructure, most of the time it has inequitable outcomes. It is inequitably experienced, right? We think about all of the infrastructure projects and where do our infrastructure dollars go oftentimes? It's to the squeaky wheel, right? That's where we start first. And so really, if we reimagine what's possible when we build equity into a shared research infrastructure early, and I think that we could accomplish really magnifying education science faster, more efficiently, more equitably and inclusively than ever before, we could change American education. And it would have different voices at the center, leading different kinds of questions. We'd have different student bodies engaged with the work. And we'd have faculty and administrators and staff sort of engaged in the process of this development. And that's what I would like to see, a fully inclusive R&D infrastructure.
Mark, what do you think?
Well, it's all.
You already threw one idea out there, but you know, why don't you sort of
Wait a
hum a
second,
few
I
bars?
don't get any credit for all the investments in platforms.
Match and.
You're
Don't I
doing,
get-
you're,
don't
you're
I get
doing,
any-
you're
don't I
doing
get
a
any
lot.
credit
You're doing
for
a lot.
this insane pursuit of prizes. I mean, so a couple of days ago, I came very close to quitting because we did the X Prize. And we're about to launch 2 other prizes. So a science prize, a middle school science prize. I'm announcing, I've talked about this, but we're getting really close to actually announcing a middle school science prize. So science education in the United States is a disaster. And I mean, like someone says, like, what keeps you up at night? 67% of 12th grade Black students are below basic in NAEP. 50-some-odd% of Hispanic 12th graders are below basic in NAEP. 45% of all 12th graders are below basic in NAEP. We want a STEM workforce, a diverse, strong STEM workforce, where that many students can't do basic science, we are in deep trouble. So we wanted to launch this the science prize. We're going to launch it, and then we're going to launch a 4th grade math challenge for students with special needs. Two prizes, and they can't be X prizes because government contracting. So so we were engaged. We're getting closer and closer to the science prize, which got enormous positive feedback from the private philanthropies. And they want the prize. They want learning outcomes, but they also want science back on the agenda, higher up on the agenda. And like I was running to just so many incredible problems, taking money from private foundations, right? So we're going to put $1 million in, and I've gotten pledges for another $1 million, right? And like it was just an incredible negotiation. I mean, fortunately, the Department of Education, the people that had approved it, but it was like, this is insane. I have $1 million in private money for something that is like really, really, really important, and it's just like, shoot me, right? Don't shoot me.
I won't shoot.
Anyway, yeah. So give me some credit for some of this.
Lots of credit, lots of room. Angela.
So one thing we haven't yet talked about is that politics in this country over the last couple of years have pervaded all areas of life, including K-12 education. And one thing we've discovered in the last 2 years is that politics should be a bipartisan, kind of like who could be against innovation. And in education, but we have found that it's very, very difficult to do anything anywhere, in any district or any school, because there is so much political charge going on. It's really hard to verbalize, but I will say this: what if, in addition to doing school-based platforms, what if you could reach teenagers directly? So it turns out most teenagers know how to use a laptop or a phone and are very good at interacting with technology, turns out. And what if we could create a research platform which, in addition to the resources that we've talked about, scientists at University of Chicago or University of Tennessee or wherever who have a really good idea, who want to ask questions of teenagers or maybe show them something for the purpose of science, could interact with those students directly without actually their school districts as an intermediary. So that is our big bet, talking about speaking unfiltered, because we think that the politics, and maybe this is a bit of the pessimist in me, I'm largely an optimist, I don't know that the politics are going to get dramatically better in the short-term future, and we know that we need to do research in the short-term future. So that's a what if for me.
So I'm sorry, could I just follow up?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So when schools were closing, fortunately that seems to be behind us now. We were desperate to identify schools that were closed, modes of instruction. So someone came to us and said, look, I have an arrangement, I forgot the cell company, a company that monitors cell phones, right? And they said, we could look at patterns of use, and we could tell you how many calls are coming out of each school, right? And we could tell, like, there's 2 of them on Thursday, but on Friday, there are 20 of them, right? 20 calls. And we could just track this pattern, and they asked us for NAEP data to
match it. Yeah.
Because we have very detailed data about modes of instruction. And I must admit, it was a great idea. But you may be able to do this teenage thing, but the thing that I'm sitting there thinking, like, could a federal agency start tapping into phone usage data, right?
No.
But what is the
so.
so what? Yeah. So we decided to pass on it. But some of the most innovative things are like maybe a step too far for a federal agency.
We should ideate and then curate, and the ideation space will be larger than the practical space that we have to move in. But I think we should start with what's desirable, and then start to think about like risks and constraints. Because the idea, though, that we should be able to do some of these things, we should start there.
So this is a perfect way to close. which is I really encourage everyone to continue to send in your ideas. I want to thank this incredible panel. These are all stars doing incredible work who took time to fly here, took time to be here. And I want to thank all of you for your incredible participation. I thought the questions were amazing. And we'll stick around for those who are here and also available online to keep chatting about this important work. Thank you so much.